Welcome, everybody. Welcome to CARB's Commercial Harborcraft Technical Working Group. This is the first workshop on orientation and technical foundation. Welcome. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes, give folks time to arrive. You'll see some instructions going into the chat on the interpretation function. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first workshop, Orientation and Technical Foundation for CARB's Commercial Harborcraft Technical Working Group. We're going to get started here in just a second. Thank you for your patience. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to CARB's Commercial Harborcraft Technical Working Group. This is the first workshop, the Orientation and Technical Foundation workshop, and we'll get started shortly. Aldo, if you want to, I think we can start tag teaming interpretation here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank
Muy
you.
buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy con el grupo de trabajo técnico de embarcaciones portuarias comerciales. Vamos a comenzar ahorita a la brevedad. Gracias.
We will be having live interpretation in Spanish and English during today's meeting, and we'll go over those instructions here in a few seconds.
Además, vamos a proporcionar interpretación en vivo, en español y en inglés, y a la brevedad vamos a repasar ahorita las indicaciones.
You'll see now in the chat a written version of those instructions.
Ahora en el chat ustedes van a ver las indicaciones que las hemos puesto ahí por escrito para que se puedan orientar.
Great. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. For those who have just arrived, welcome. You are at CARB's first Commercial Harborcraft Technical Working Group workshop. This is the Orientation and Technical Foundation workshop. Next slide, please.
Muy bien, bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos y bienvenidos. Esta es la primer taller que vamos a estar realizando con este tipo técnico de trabajo del grupo de embarcaciones. Muy bien.
Great. We're going to go over the language interpretation instructions. We do have live Spanish interpretation for today's meeting.
Muy bien, vamos a repasar ahorita las indicaciones de cómo activar la interpretación.
You'll see also in the chat a written version of those instructions.
Y también, como mencioné anteriormente, van a ver en el chat las indicaciones que están por escrito.
Okay. So in your meeting webinar controls at the bottom of your screen, when I launch the interpretation function, you're going to see a globe that says interpretation.
Verán en la parte inferior, una vez que active la interpretación, van a ver un icono en forma de un mundo que dice interpretación.
You'll need to click the language that you would like to hear for today's meeting, and those options for today are English and Spanish.
Van a tener que presionar en ese icono y van a tener que elegir de esas opciones el idioma de su preferencia, ya sea tanto en inglés o en español.
So don't forget, even if you're listening in the English channel, you will still need to click the globe, the interpretation function, and select English.
Y recuerden, si es que ustedes están escuchando la reunión en inglés, aún así deben de elegir inglés para que puedan escuchar la reunión y elegir audio original.
And then once you've chosen the English or Spanish channel, then you can click mute original audio, and you'll be all set to go.
Y una vez que hagan esas partes anteriores, van a presionarle nuevamente y van a elegir poner en silencio audio original y estarán ya listos para comenzar.
Great. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and launch the interpretation function, and you'll see that globe appear at the bottom of your screen.
Muy bien.
Okay, so you just heard Aldo switch over to the Spanish audio channel. I'll give folks a moment here to click on the globe, select English, and then also select mute original audio. All right, we can go to the next slide. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please make sure to keep yourself muted during the presentations and while other folks are talking, and to rename yourself with your first name, last name, pronouns, and your affiliation. To rename yourself, you can click on the top right side of your picture or video, and there's a sample there of how you can rename yourself. Next slide, please. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Bonnie Soriano. She's the chief of the Freight Activity Branch with CARB for a few welcome and opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone who's joined us for this first of 3 technical working group meetings for the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation. So as I was introduced, I'm Bonnie Soriano. I'm a branch chief in the Freight Activity Branch. And our branch oversees the program team. And also at this meeting, we have other staff from the enforcement division and our legal office within CARB, and also our division office. And so again, I wanted to thank everyone for spending your time. I know everybody's super busy, so we really appreciate having you here. I also wanted to give a little bit of high-level background before we launch into the speaking components of the workshop. So the working group came about from direction from the California Air Resources Board during the rulemaking process. And so during that rulemaking process in March of 2022, the board directed us in resolution 22-6, which also approved the amendments to the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation. And in this resolution, the board directed us to do really 2 things. They asked us to keep them updated on the commercial availability of lower emitting combustion engines, and to keep them up to date on the progress of zero emission technology for all categories of hovercraft. They also directed us to report back to the board this year in 2024, and every 2 years after that up through 2032. And so this is the outcome of that board direction, our technical working group, and this is a public group. It welcomes all affected stakeholders, including vessel operators, industry associations, environmental and community-based organizations, community members, technology developers, engine and after-treatment manufacturers, academia, and other government agencies, and any other interested member of the public. So this meeting is the first of 3 meetings that will inform our report to the board, which is due by the end of this year. And so I wanted to give a couple of pieces of recognition for help that we have asked for during this process. We have 2 contracts that are helping us with this process. The first is you met our guide from California State University, Sacramento, who we have contracted to facilitate these meetings. And then the other contract we have is with the University of California, Irvine, to perform a technical assessment. And that technical assessment, which is due out later this year, is going to provide some technical background for our report to the board, which is due by the end of this year. And that tech assessment is really the main focus of the next technical working group meeting. So for these meetings, we are tapping into the expertise of stakeholders. And you will see throughout the meetings where we have panels where the stakeholders can directly participate in the panels and speak about their experiences and their expertise in implementing this regulation. And I'd really like to thank all of you in advance. I know our team has been working hard to connect with you and find the right spot for you to participate in the panels. So I want to thank everyone in advance. And so the focus of today's meeting really is more foundational. So CARB's going to be providing an overview of the regs and kind of a high-level overview of common technologies that will be used to meet the requirements. In addition, we have a panel of environmental and community groups, and that panel lays the foundation and articulates the need for emissions reductions and the associated health benefits that will be achieved with this regulation. I'd also like to give a little background of what these meetings are not intended to include. These meetings are not structured to answer case-by-case implementation questions. Any of those types of questions will be held to the end, where if we have some time, we can address them or determine the appropriate follow-up for those questions. Also, this is not a formal rulemaking process, although it did come from a resolution during the formal rulemaking process. This is a process to inform and update our board as directed under the resolution. So in closing my opening, the CARB team would like to acknowledge the wealth of perspectives and expertise in this group. You guys really bring it all to the table. We would also like to acknowledge industry's work to comply with the regulation, the technology providers in advancing the technology, and the community environmental groups for their work in advocating and articulating the need for public health benefits. So with that, I'll turn it back to our facilitator.
Great. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you for that great introduction and for helping set the tone and provide important context for today's meeting. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to review today's agenda with all of you very quickly. We're going to finish up welcoming and opening remarks, and then we're going to have an overview of the Commercial Harbor Craft Regulation. We'll have a 10-minute break after that, and we'll resume with Commercial Harbor Craft requirements and technology. We're going to have a Q&A for 15 minutes on that content. And then we'll proceed with the panel discussion with our community-based organizations and environmental organizations. And then we'll also have another 15-minute Q&A following the panel discussion for any questions regarding the panel content. And then we'll adjourn with some closing remarks. Next slide. So Bonnie provided a great introduction. Thank you. For the facilitation team and our role, my name is Julia Cernansky. My colleague Dave Cephos is also a member of our facilitation team who is unable to be here today. Our role is really to help support CARB in coordinating with workshop presenters and panelists and to help develop workshop materials, and also as a neutral third party to help ensure that this is a process where all participants' interests and views, opinions are heard and thoughtfully considered. Next slide. I also want to review with you a little bit the technical working group composition and guidelines. So the technical working groups are open, or this technical working group is open to the public, and all participants have been and will be invited to attend via CARB's Commercial Harbor Craft government delivery notifications. The workshop presentations and panels will include a cross-section of panelists invited by CARB and who are directly impacted by the Commercial Harbor Craft Regulation and or affected by commercial harbor craft and associated combustion emissions. We also have some meeting guidelines for the technical working group. That is that we all be prepared to actively participate according to the items on the workshop agenda, that we maintain that all participants are heard and that only one participant speaks at a time. We'll be using the raise hand function and the Q&A function to help facilitate that. Also want to refrain from side conversations and stay focused on our agenda topics at hand. When it's appropriate, we ask that you distinguish between your personal perspective and your organizational perspective. And finally, we ask that everybody treat all participants respectfully. I'll be dropping some links into the chat after I finish with the opening remarks so that you guys can access some of these materials that are cited on the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to review the workshop objectives for this workshop, and then also generally the timeline for the 3 technical working group workshops. So the purpose of this workshop is to provide an orientation to the purpose, objectives, and scope of the technical working group. We're also going to provide an overview of the Commercial Harborcraft Regulation. Additionally, there will be an overview of commercial harborcraft requirements and a technical foundation to establish a common baseline of information. And then we'll also have a panel discussion to share the insights and perspectives of affected communities via community-based organizations and environmental organizations. So those are the objectives of workshop 1. Now the timeline for our 3 workshops is as follows. This is the first workshop. Workshop 2 is scheduled for May 29th from 12 to 4:30 p.m. And the topic of that workshop will be the technology assessment. Workshop 3 has not been scheduled yet, but we will let you know as soon as it is. And the topic of that workshop will be best practices and expertise sharing. Next slide. Great. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Melissa Houchin, and she's going to take it away and start our section on overview of Commercial Harborcraft Regulation.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Houchin. I'll be kicking off the technical working group presentations with an overview of the Commercial Harborcraft Regulation. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with going over the purpose of this technical working group, which is to assess the commercial availability of lower emitting combustion engines and zero emission technology for all types of harborcraft. This is something our board asked us to do when they approved the amendments to the Commercial Harborcraft Regulation in 2022. The goal is to provide and exchange information which captures the range of perspectives and experiences of participants, including both communities and industry. The technical working group will provide insights regarding commercial availability, feasibility, effectiveness, potential barriers, and processes for technology adoption. This presentation will provide an overview of the Commercial Harborcraft Regulation to provide context and background. The third workshop will include an implementation-focused panel, so there will be an opportunity to discuss implementation experiences in more detail at that time. Next slide. Let's start with what are commercial harborcraft. Commercial harborcraft is defined in the regulation as all commercial vessels that are not ocean-going vessels or recreational vessels. Commercial harborcraft vessels have diverse operations. They are typically, but not always, diesel fueled, and they can operate throughout the state. And although activity is concentrated near seaports, marinas, and harbors, the emissions from commercial harborcraft affect communities statewide, and the impacts are felt over 50 miles inland. Next slide. This slide lists the major vessel categories of commercial harborcraft and many but not all of the subcategories of each vessel type. Vessel types are described in our staff report, which is available on the Commercial Harborcraft rulemaking page and is also linked on this slide. This link can be accessed from the presentation posted on the technical working group page on the CHC program website. Next slide. The Commercial Harborcraft Regulation was first adopted in 2008, was amended in 2010, and then amended again in 2022. The 2010 amendments established requirements for vessel operators to turn over to Tier 2 or 3 engines by the end of 2022 for select vessel categories, which included ferries, tugboats, barges, excursion vessels, crew and supply vessels, and dredge vessels. The 2010 amendments also required Tier 4 engines or cleaner controls for ferries built after 2009 that carry 75 passengers or more. The regulation also required vessel owners and operators to use CARB ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, measure operating hours, and report engine and vessel information to CARB. The 2010 amended regulation had compliance dates up until 2022 when it was fully implemented. Next slide. The categories in the left column were subject to the 2010 regulation and were required to turn over to Tier 2 or 3 standards, but there are a variety of other hovercraft that have significant emission contributions that had no requirements to upgrade engines until the 2022 amendments. The vessel categories on the right are new vessel categories the 2022 amendments added, which includes all commercial vessels, workboats, pilot, research, sport fishing, commercial fishing, all barges, engines under 50 horsepower, and all CHC vessels regardless of fuel type. Next slide, please. In support of California's many air quality standards, targets, and goals to meet over the next 30 years, zero emission requirements are a top priority of the regulation and were established where feasible, including in 2025, new build excursion vessels must be zero emission capable, and in 2026, all short run ferries must transition to full zero emission operation. We estimate that over 100 vessels will be operating with zero emission capabilities by the 2030s due to some alternative compliance options and funding programs that encourage the adoption of zero emission and advanced technology, or ZEET. Adopting ZEET requires an application to be submitted to CARB, and as of April 2024, CARB has received several ZEET applications which are being processed by staff. Next slide. To achieve the greatest emission reductions and public health benefits, the 2022 amendments require engines to meet performance standards equivalent to the cleanest US EPA certified engine available and the use of a diesel particulate filter, or DPF. The amendments require the use of Tier 4 engines if they are certified for the size and duty cycle of an engine. For engines under 600 kilowatts, if there are no Tier 4 certified engines available for the size and duty cycle needed, a Tier 3 can be used. Engines that have an integrated DPF and meet the performance standards in the regulation in their EPA certified configuration may also be used. Next slide. The 2022 regulation includes a compliance option called Alternative Control of Emissions, or ACE. This is a plan created by an operator that will result in equivalent emission reductions as following the model year compliance schedule outlined in the regulation. The application is required to be submitted to CARB no later than December 31st, 2025. The plan would need to show equivalent emission reductions from a hovercraft fleet's operations between January 1st, 2023 through December 31st, 2034. ACE plans must receive CARB approval with a public process review and cannot increase emissions in disadvantaged communities. The regulation also includes a zero emission and advanced technology credit to incentivize the adoption of zero emission. An operator deploying a zero emission or zero emission capable vessel can receive additional compliance time for another vessel in the fleet. 3 years for a zero emission capable vessel and 7 years for a full zero emission vessel. The low use exception pathway is a pathway for vessels that have been and will continue to operate under low use thresholds. The 2022 regulation updated the low use thresholds from 300 hours annually for most vessels to a tiered structure with lower low use limits for older engines. Low use thresholds are also more stringent for vessels operating in proximity to disadvantaged communities. The low use pathway requires CARB approval prior to the vessel's compliance date. Next slide. Several compliance extensions are available to operators to provide additional flexibility for circumstances that may be out of their control. I'll not be going into detail on these at this time, but all of this information is outlined in our compliance extension fact sheet on the CHC website. Next slide. Compliance dates range from December 31st, 2023 to December 31st, 2032. Extensions are available as noted on the previous slide. However, extensions cannot extend beyond December 31st, 2034. Next slide. The regulation includes these additional requirements. Vessels must be labeled following the format shown on the slide. The labels must have a green background, black letters, and comply with requirements for location and size of the label. Engines must meet smoke opacity limits, and opacity testing must be conducted biennially to ensure engines and emission control systems are properly maintained. Reporting is now required annually for vessels and facilities. Facilities that receive more than 50 commercial hovercraft vessel visits per year are required to install shore power for commercial hovercraft up to 99 kilowatts. Compliance fees are assessed annually for all commercial hovercraft except commercial fishing vessels. Vessels are also required to be fueled with renewable diesel as of January 1st, 2023, and vessels are subject to idling limits while at dock. Next slide. These figures show the estimated emissions in 2035 with and without the implementation of the 2022 regulation, with diesel PM emissions on the left in tons per year and NOx emissions on the right in tons per day. Statewide, the regulation is expected to result in an 89% reduction in diesel particulate matter emissions and a 54% reduction in oxides of nitrogen emissions from hovercraft by 2035. Next slide. Since the amended regulation went into effect in December 2022, CARB staff have been focused on implementation. We've been focusing efforts on processing extension and low-use applications and answering questions about the regulation. We also started collecting fees based on reports received in 2023. We are processing reports as they come in. Annual reports are due every year on March 31st, and the first biennial opacity testing deadline also just passed on March 31st, and we recently posted guidance on alternative methods for opacity testing. Our newly expanded enforcement team has been conducting outreach and renewable diesel fuel surveys throughout the state. And we have been meeting with EPA regarding the Clean Air Act authorization, which is in progress. Next slide. Finally, we have a number of fact sheets and resources available on the CHC program webpage. These are some key fact sheets, and there are more on the fact sheets webpage that's linked. Questions about the regulation requirements or extensions should be sent to the Commercial Hovercraft email inbox, which is harborcraft@arb.ca.gov. And that concludes the overview of the regulation. So I'll turn it back over to Julia.
Great, thank you, Melissa. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so I think at this point we are going to use that extra time to stop and see if anybody has any questions regarding Melissa's presentation. You can offer a question by clicking the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question verbally. And then you can also use the Q&A box to submit a question, and CARB staff will either respond in a written response, or I'll read your question out loud and we'll address it verbally. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. I do see one hand up from Ramin Ross. Go ahead. What's your question?
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me all right?
I'm not hearing you. Oh, there you are. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Melissa, for the presentation. I really appreciate you laying out the foundation. I had a couple of questions.
Ramin, I'm not hearing you.
Can other folks hear me?
Is anybody else hearing Ramin? Okay. Ramin, maybe make sure that you're in the English channel. So if you click on the bottom of your screen, the little globe that says interpretation, and then click English, that might be it.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, interesting. I did have to turn the interpretation on. Thank you, Julia. Appreciate that guidance.
No problem.
I just wanted to say thank you, Melissa, for taking the time to give this presentation. I think it's helpful to set the foundation. I had a couple of questions regarding the compliance extension process. The first of which is, are you able to provide any insight as to what is ahead next for those that have already submitted their extension application, in particular looking for timelines and milestones that those applicants can keep in the back of their head?
Sure. So if an operator's already submitted their extension application, it goes into a queue. And so the timeline can vary just depending on how many we are processing at any given time. But as we process it, if we need anything, any additional information or anything like that, we'll reach out. and then you'll kind of know that we are actively processing it. And so I would just basically keep an eye out for any emails from us, because the quicker we can get the whatever information we need from you, then the quicker we can process it. Hopefully
Okay.
that answers your question. There's no like distinct timeline for each application right now.
Okay. So it's not tied to like I know you guys are gonna do the technical assessment and then end of your report to the board. So these applications are not tied to or related to any of those milestones that you need to report
Right.
back to your board. Okay.
Yeah, they will just be ongoing during implementation. So
Got it. Thank you so much. And my second question is relating to that processing time. It sounds like they're sort of coming in gradually. Are you seeing a relatively large load or maybe more than you had expected? Again, just trying to get a sense of how big that queue is, how long that queue is, I should say.
I'm not sure in terms of what we were expecting. I wouldn't say it's that much more than we were expecting. Extension requests tend to come in a certain time, like, so each extension has to be submitted within a certain time frame before the compliance date. So the extension requests we're seeing right now are for vessels that have compliance dates coming up, whereas vessels with compliance dates later on probably aren't sending them super early. So it's probably just going to be staggered based on compliance dates, if that makes sense. I don't know if Andrew or Tracy wants to add in terms of like the volume that we're getting right now.
Yeah, I think you said it in terms of volume. You know, they're staggered depending on the compliance date, and so there are certain times that we expect to be getting more applications. You know, such as the 10-year extension application deadline is coming up, so we expect to get more during that time. But it just depends on the timing of when they're required to be submitted in the regulation relative to the compliance deadline.
Okay. And I know I'm don't not mean to hog the questions, but I do have one more. I should have probably introduced myself. Ramin Ross with Western States Petroleum Association. Our members are really impacted by this rule, more so from the facility side infrastructure requirements that you'd covered, Melissa, less on the vessel side. And so my questions are geared really toward the facility side implementation. Our facility side compliance extension requests handled by this group as well? And are you kind of seeing those roll in and processing those similar to the vessel side?
Yes, those will be processed the same way, and also just put into the queue depending on when we get them. We have, I mean, a majority of the extensions we're getting are from vessel owners. But anything from facilities is going to be processed the same way. So whether it's the E1 infrastructure extension or the shore power exemption, either way, they just get processed the same way.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ramin, for your question. Just a quick reminder, everyone, please be sure to select the English channel and the interpretation function. If for whatever reason you're not hearing the conversation, that might be why. So we're going to go ahead and take the next question, which is from Lewis. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Luis Arvelo. I'm with Seabulk, represent owners, and we have some vessels that trade on the west coast of the nation, particularly California, of course. I have a question in regards to renewable diesel, the R99. If there is a delivery of bunkers that may have some of this renewable diesel out of spec, or there's any concerns with the delivery of or burning the renewable diesel, is there an appropriate reporting channel with CARB in regards to out of spec renewable diesel?
I would say pretty much any implementation issues you're having can go to the Harborcraft inbox that's linked at the bottom of this slide, and then we can always send it to like the appropriate person if needed. But anything implementation related can just go to the Harborcraft inbox, I would say.
All right, perfect. I appreciate that. That was my question.
Great. Thank you, Lewis. And I've gone ahead and put that email address in the chat for everybody in case anybody else would like to utilize that. We do have some questions in the Q&A box. Our CARB staff are working diligently to answer some of those written, but I'm going to go ahead and read out loud one of these questions. This is a question from Noel. Smoke opacity machines do not have the technology to perform the tests on commercial hovercraft as of yet. How are we to test? Even testing above the waterline is dangerous to the individual performing the test in an enclosed engine room. According to the Coast Guard, it is not safe. What is CARB's stance? The software and hardware are not available.
I'm gonna ask Andrew to take this question. I know we, as I mentioned in the presentation, we did recently come out with some guidance on opacity testing, but I'll ask Andrew to answer. He's kind of the expert on this.
Hello, everybody. So for vessels with wet exhaust systems, like Melissa stated, we've recently published a second attachment to the original opacity fact sheet. So there's 3 different scenarios that operators can follow in there. Scenario 1 is for vessels with wet exhaust. There's a process in there that those operators can follow to utilize the alternative compliance method that's available in the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation under K1D. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that for now. Don't want to get off on too much of a tangent. If you have any additional questions on that, please forward them to the Commercial Hovercraft inbox.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And
Julia,
yeah, good reminder.
I'm sorry, I think maybe we can cover, while we're on the subject of opacity, maybe we can cover some of the other opacity questions that are in this Q&A box.
Sure. I'll just read aloud for our Spanish language participants. We have a question from Jeremy. For hovercrafts that did not opacity test before the March 31st, 2024 deadline, should they still test? If so, will they get credit for 2024 compliance?
The answer to that is yes. If you have not submitted the opacity test that was due March 31st, please do still go ahead and submit it. We are still taking reports that are submitted at this point.
Great. And I think that was the only other opacity question in there. Is that right, Tracy?
I'm seeing one from Jeremy Ostrander.
Okay. Another question from Jeremy Ostrander, who says, we are able to test dry exhaust efficiently. However, to comply with Coast Guard, we have to install a test port that allows us to test at the deck. This process is costly and time consuming. Can we get an advisory for extension on wet exhaust to allow more time?
So Jeremy, there's no extension available. And like Melissa stated, the deadline for reporting has already passed, but CARB is still accepting late submissions at this time. And so, like I previously stated, for all vessels with wet exhaust systems, those operators are eligible to follow the instructions that are outlined in scenario 1 of the opacity fact sheet attachment 2 that is published on CARB's Commercial Hovercraft website under fact sheets.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I see a hand up from one of our attendees, Christian Stark. Go ahead, what's your question?
Hello, thank you. This is Christian Stark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. I was just going to comment on that because I believe the issue with the opacity testing, from what I heard, is the test device does not seal to the port, and the Coast Guard was setting off fire alarms in the engine rooms. The Coast Guard was raising questions as to whether they were going to allow it. So I think there needs to be some work done on how to seal those ports to the test equipment.
Okay, so let me clarify. I'll give a little more detail on the alternative compliance method available for vessels with wet exhaust systems under K1D and the regulation. So
that was dry, Andrew.
So for a vessel with dry exhaust, you would normally be testing that at the stack location at the end of the exhaust pipe run, correct?
No.
You would not need to take a partial flow sample. You would be able to test that exhaust system at the end of the exhaust run.
Usually it's wherever they have space in the boat to put the port. They don't have a lot of flexibility. I believe the issue was whatever test equipment they used did not seal where it went in the port. There was a lot of blow by.
Okay, when you're doing partial flow sampling, you can either sample from a port at a midpoint on the exhaust run, or you can sample at the end of the exhaust run. CARB does not specify where that sample needs to be taken. There's nothing in the regulation. So ordinarily with a dry exhaust system, the opacity measurement is done at the end of the exhaust run at the top of the stack.
Yeah, and I guess the issue there is most of these boats don't have a traditional dry stack you could do that with. The exhaust pipe is exiting in a location that's not accessible underway. So, and
well,
I just
want to bring that up. Certain vessel designs could potentially present challenges if there's like a horizontal waterline exit with dry exhaust.
Everyone's been putting in I think a 1-inch NPT pipe port into the dry exhaust in some place that's accessible inside the boat. And what I heard from my understanding is the test port does not come with the ability to seal it as it goes into that opening. So that was there needs to be some kind of packing gland designed or something to seal the test equipment when it goes in the port.
Yeah. I would say that it's
in here. Sorry, Andrew, I'm going to step in. I think this is a conversation that we can follow up with you with, Christian. Just want to make sure that we're making space for some of the other hands that are up, and we got quite a few questions in the chat. But thank you, Christian, and we'll follow up. Appreciate that. Okay, so we have quite a few other questions in the Q&A. We have one from Cheryl. How many exemptions require a naval architect study?
Go ahead.
Sorry,
I'm hearing myself echo. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I assume, Charlotte, that you're referring to the extensions as opposed to exemptions. The only extension that requires naval architect study is the E3 extension for feasibility.
Great, thanks, Tracy. And we have a hand up from Joshua. Go ahead, what's your question? Let's see, Joshua Kehoe. You can go ahead and unmute. We're not hearing you. You might be in the wrong audio channel. So if you click on the bottom of your screen, the little globe, and then click English.
Yeah, I think I raised my hand on
there
accident.
You
are.
Yeah, I can hear.
Oh, okay.
No,
Great.
I think I raised my hand on accident. Apologies.
Oh, no problem, Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
No problem. Okay. All right, so we'll go to one of the questions in the Q&A now from William Smith. Since the Coast Guard has stated that they will not be involved in enforcement of the rules, how will you move forward with its enforcement?
I think I'll start with the response, and then maybe ask if there's some additional information. But you know, this is, I think, more about the structural, how the regulations are enforced both on a federal level and a state level. And so CARB enforces, this is a CARB rule. CARB will enforce this rule. It would not be under the jurisdiction of, in this case, the U.S. Coast Guard to enforce our rule. So it's more about jurisdiction, not about whether the Coast Guard decides to or not to enforce a regulation. So I think that was the first part. Can you read me the second part of that question, Julia?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Hold on, I think it went to a different.
Oh, I have it. It
area.
was, how will you move forward with its enforcement?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, essentially, we move forward as we do. We have our whole enforcement division, not branch, but division arm of CARB. We have some of the enforcement staff here today. So we'll continue with the same process that we use for enforcement of our rules, you know, across the agency.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. I see 2 hands up from attendees. Jeremy, we addressed 2 questions in the chat, so I'm gonna click on someone that we haven't heard from yet, and then I'll get to you. So Nilda, what is your question?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thank you for the time. Thank you for the information. It's very helpful, helping us navigate all this crazy regulation not coming our way. I'm an operator in Long Beach, and as I look at what we're doing and what we're proposing to do, new technology, zero emissions, all that stuff is great, but it's very expensive. What type of funding will be available for us to be able to help us achieve the zero emissions or the hybrid status for many of us that we can't go fully zero emissions yet? Will there be more funding available in this new year of Carl Moyer funding for Harborcraft? And also, how will that be allocated in terms of the type of businesses and the size of businesses that are applying for the funding? How will you guys make sure that there is equitable access for the smallest ones?
So CARB does not actually allocate funds for Moyer. That's going to be handled with your local air district. So if you have Moyer specific questions, it might be good to reach out to your air district on those. We do have a funding fact sheet linked on this slide, and so this presentation is available on our website where you can click these links. I don't want to spend too much time talking about funding. That's more of an implementation issue. If you want to talk more offline, please reach out to the Harborcraft inbox, and we can always set up a meeting with you and talk more in detail at that time.
Great, thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Nilda. All right, we have a question in the Q&A from James. Is the U.S. Coast Guard participating in these sessions to help ensure that any new proposed regulations meet U.S. CG safety standards for Harborcraft vessels?
So the answer to that is yes, the Coast Guard is participating. We are planning to bring them to do a presentation in the 3rd workshop later this year. And as Bonnie said, you know, in her introduction, this is not a rulemaking effort. So these work group meetings are not proposing any regulations.
Great, thanks, Tracy, for clarifying that. We've got about 10 minutes left and a few hands up and more questions in the Q&A. So if folks can keep their questions brief so that we can try to get to everyone, that would be great. Jeremy, go ahead.
Hi, this is Jeremy, diesel exhaust emissions. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, hey, just going back to a comment Christian was asking earlier about the testing on the opacity. So so we are able to test on the dry exhaust, obviously at the tailpipe. On the wet exhaust, there's quite a bit involved because we have to put a test port. It is a sealed tight test port. It does allow 100% sealed tight to get the exhaust to the deck. So it is Coast Guard approved. The challenge is there's so many different case-by-case scenarios, and it's especially for a small shop like ours, as we're quoting those out, it takes a long time for us to go down the engine compartments and see what we have to do to put a proper 100% sealed tight exhaust flange that can V-band clamp and put the right type of tubing that's 100% contained. It's just time consuming and costly. So I guess my thing is more time on advisories that give wet exhaust the time to actually get this done?
I'll answer this one. So, first I would say if you haven't yet, take a look at that additional guidance that we posted as an attachment to the opacity testing fact sheet. If you still have questions or concerns, please reach out to the Harborcraft inbox and we'll take this conversation offline and work more directly with you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, let me add a little bit to that too, Melissa. So just to clarify, if the vessel has wet exhaust, there is no requirement at this point to complete the actual opacity testing procedure. The engine would be eligible to comply using the outlined alternative compliance methods in the new attachment, which would include engine inspections as opposed to doing the opacity testing. So to reiterate, there's no requirement on the wet exhaust systems to actually do the opacity testing.
Great, thanks, Andrew and Melissa. Oh, Tracy, were you going to add anything to that?
Yeah, just a little bit. I was just going to clarify that, the regulation language itself allows for alternative compliance in certain situations where there are issues with conducting the testing procedure. So that's what Andrew is referring to in terms of the guidance that we've posted. It sort of kind of explains further what that means and provides some guidance around that. So yeah, so we encourage you to take a look at that. We also it's also a possibility to submit other alternative compliance methods through that pathway in the regulation.
Great, thanks. All right. And we'll go to, oh, I see Adriana put the link to that fact sheet in the chat. Thank you, Adriana. We have a question in the Q&A. Coast Guard requires an emergency power source, whether it be a storage battery or emergency generator. If a zero emission capable vessel is equipped with an emergency generator, what is the tier requirement for that emergency generator?
The tier requirement would be the same as any other engine on a hovercraft.
Great, thanks, Tracy. And we have a hand up from John. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I can't hear anything.
Go ahead. Yeah, he's still muted. John, if you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute. Okay, we'll go ahead and go back to the Q&A. John, raise your hand again if you do have that question. We have a question from Don, who says, just to confirm, it appears the regulation as it relates to ZEAT was geared for in-use short-run ferries and newly acquired excursion vessels. If so, what schedule, application process, if any, would other vessel categories such as research follow if they want to purchase hybrid zero-emission Tier 3-4 propulsion engines?
So the only vessel categories required to go zero emission or zero emission capable hybrid are the short run ferries and new excursion vessels, as you mentioned. So for a research vessel, there's no requirement to, and so you wouldn't need to submit a ZEAT application with us unless you wanted to use the ZEAT credit or use it as part of an alternative compliance pathway or something like that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And we only have 2 questions left in a few minutes. So I think once we finish with these, we'll go ahead and take it.
Sorry, Julia,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I think we want to clarify that a little bit because that language can be a little confusing. So as Melissa said, those vessel categories that are required to go zero emission or zero emission capable hybrid are required to use that, what we call ZEAT application process. If another vessel category is choosing to adopt that technology as it's defined in the regulation. So zero emission and zero emission capable hybrid are terms that are defined in the regulation. So if you are intending to adopt the technology that meets those definitions, then yes, you would still use the application pathway for that. If you are thinking about another pathway, such as a different type of hybrid or something else, then that would probably require an ACE plan. But any specific questions, you know, we can take those offline as well.
Okay, and we are actually at time. Sorry, guys, we went 5 minutes over. So next slide, please. All right, so we're going to go on a break for 10 minutes, and we will be back at 2:05. So feel free to grab a coffee, stretch your legs, and we will be back in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you're all able to stretch your legs, maybe grab some coffee or tea. Next slide, please. We're going to continue with our presentations. Great. All right, so I'll hand it over to Andrew Damiano for our next portion of the presentation, which are commercial hovercraft requirements and technology.
All right, thank you. My name is Andrew Damiano. I'm the staff air pollution specialist in CARB's freight technology section. This is a short presentation on the basics of commercial hovercraft technology that CARB's regulated stakeholders may utilize to comply with the amended commercial hovercraft regulation. Next slide, please. For commercial hovercraft powered by diesel engines, compliance with CARB's Tier 3 and Tier 4 end-use performance standards outlined in the amended commercial hovercraft regulation generally require US EPA Marine certified Tier 3 engines with a CARB verified level 3 diesel particulate filter capable of removing 85% or higher of diesel particulate matter in applications below 600 kilowatts. Applications above 600 kilowatts generally require Tier 4 engines with a CARB verified level 3 diesel particulate filter. However, a cleanest engine requirement may also apply that could require operators to install Tier 4 engines and to meet CARB's Tier 4 end-use performance standards in applications below 600 kilowatts if a suitable Tier 4 marine or marinized Tier 4 final engine is commercially available 12 months prior to the applicable compliance deadline or at the time of engine replacement in the case of newly acquired replacement engines. Short-run ferries operating on routes under 3 nautical miles are subject to operating with full zero-emission technology after December 31st, 2025, typically requiring operators to employ electric propulsion systems with hydrogen fuel cell power or onboard battery energy storage systems charged with grid power. New build or newly acquired excursion vessels after December 31st, 2024 are subject to meeting CARB's definition of a zero-emission capable hybrid vessel, typically requiring operators to employ electric propulsion systems, onboard battery energy storage systems, and diesel electric generators meeting CARB's applicable end-use performance standards. Zero-emission capable hybrid vessels are required to utilize 30% or more of total annual vessel power from a zero-emission tailpipe power source. Next slide, please. Slide 27 shows the phase-in dates for ZET, or Zero Emission Advanced Technology Mandates, under the amended Commercial Hovercraft Regulation. New and newly acquired excursion vessels are subject to ZET hybrid requirements on or after December 31st, 2024. New and newly acquired and in-use short-run ferries are subject to zero-emission ZET requirements on or after December 31st, 2025. Next slide, please. Slide 28 provides additional detail on the Tier 3 and Tier 4 in-use performance standards. The standards will vary by engine power subcategory, US EPA engine category, and power density. The particulate matter standards are relatively stringent and are effectively technology forcing, requiring the use of a diesel particulate filter to meet the 0.010 grams per brake horsepower hour Tier 3 and to 0.005 grams per brake horsepower hour Tier 4 in-use performance standards. Next slide, please. Slide 29 introduces some of the technologies engine manufacturers utilize in Tier 3 marine engines to reduce engine out NOx and diesel particulate matter. Tier 3 marine engines do not utilize exhaust aftertreatment in the US EPA certified configuration, and instead rely on advanced combustion strategies, such as optimized piston crown bowl or combustion chamber design, in combination with injector tip design and placement to increase swirl or turbulence of charge air occurring on the compression stroke to improve fuel molecule oxygenation and therefore cleaner combustion when injection begins. Additional Tier 3 in-cylinder strategies include delayed injection, timing, higher fuel injection pressures, and high-pressure common rail fuel injection strategies, providing multiple injection events per combustion cycle. Next slide, please. Slide 30 introduces technologies utilized by engine manufacturers on Tier 4 marine engines to reduce engine out NOx and PM. Reducing engine out diesel PM or NOx is often a trade-off. Strategies with lower combustion temperatures and pressures tend to reduce NOx formation, but may increase diesel particulate emissions at certain engine load points due to less available in-cylinder heat for combustion of oxygenated fuel molecules. Higher combustion temperatures and peak pressures tend to improve combustion efficiency and reduce diesel PM present in engine out exhaust, but tend to increase formation of NOx. To meet US EPA Tier 4 marine emission certification standards of 0.03 grams per brake horsepower hour for PM and 1.3 grams per brake horsepower hour for NOx, combustion strategies moved away from the goal of controlling engine out NOx emissions below certification levels and instead aimed for reduced engine out diesel PM, improved engine performance and fuel efficiency, while adopting a new post-engine exhaust aftertreatment control strategy. As a result, most marine engine OEMs utilize selective catalytic reduction or SCR exhaust aftertreatment to reduce engine out NOx emissions below the Tier 4 certification standards. The General Electric Wabtec 250 MDC Category 2 Tier 4 marine engines are one exception to this, in that GE is utilizing massive exhaust gas recirculation to cool combustion temperatures to reduce engine out NOx below applicable Tier 4 certification standards. SCR aftertreatment devices typically utilize a flow-through substrate filter design with a catalyzed wash coat containing a transition metal oxide, most commonly vanadium pentoxide, which lowers the temperatures necessary for the NOx reduction reactions to occur efficiently. Where up to or greater than 90% NOx conversion may occur. However, most SCRs do not work efficiently below exhaust temperatures of 250 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. Diesel particulate filters may utilize ceramic wall flow type or fibrous metallic substrate designs with a catalyzed wash coat of platinum group metals, allowing passive soot oxidation to occur at lower exhaust temperatures encountered during normal engine operation. The most common substrate type for ceramic DPFs is cordierite, a magnesium and aluminum silicate, formed into monolithic honeycomb-like structures, allowing exhaust gases to pass through but capturing particles of diesel soot. Fibrous metallic DPF substrates also allow gases to pass through while trapping soot particles and can be actively regenerated by passing an electrical current through the substrate, inducing an increase in temperature sufficient to oxidize trapped diesel soot particles. DPF substrates must be periodically cleaned after a manufacturer's specified number of engine operating hours for cleaning and removal of accumulated ash or oxidized soot from periodic filter regeneration cycles over time. Next slide, please. Slide 32 contains a rendered image of a DPF filter substrate in operation borrowed from dieselnet.com, showing the basic principle of operation where engine exhaust gases are able to pass through the ceramic substrate walls and diesel particulate matter is trapped as soot inside the substrate channels. CARB has a verification procedure in place for verifying the performance and durability of retrofit exhaust aftertreatment systems, including multiple rounds of emissions testing and completing 1,000 hours of in-use operation durability testing. More information on CARB's verification procedure is found on the next slide. So next slide, please. CARB's verification procedure is found in Title 13, California Code of Regulations, sections 2700 through 2711. Slide 33 also contains a link to CARB's verification website. Again, a CARB verified level 3 DPF must be verified by CARB to remove at least 85% or more of diesel particulate matter. Next slide, please. Slide 34 provides some detail on technologies commonly employed in ZEET or zero emission advanced technology vessels. ZEET vessels commonly utilize electric propulsion systems with onboard energy storage systems such as lithium-ion batteries. Some vessels may utilize hydrogen fuel cells combined with onboard battery energy storage systems as another configuration to provide electrical power for zero tailpipe emission operation. Next slide, please. Slide 35 shows the basic operating principles of a proton exchange membrane fuel cell, or PEMFC. The PEMFC consumes hydrogen fuel and atmospheric oxygen from an external air pump. Through a process of gaseous diffusion, the hydrogen protons pass through the electrically non-conductive catalyzed proton exchange membrane, and the electrons are stripped off, creating an excess negative charge of electrons at the anode. The positively charged protons emerging on the other side of the proton exchange membrane form an excess positive charge, inducing a current flow through the simulated load at the top, which appears to be a small light bulb in this image. The catalyzed proton exchange membrane is a synthetic polymer commonly made of perfluorosulfonic acid, or PFSA, commonly sold under the trade names Nafion and Equivion. Next slide, please. Slide 36 provides additional information on zero-emission capable hybrid requirements in the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation. CARB's definition of zero-emission capable hybrid vessel means a commercial hovercraft utilizing a hybrid power system with 2 or more onboard power sources, 1 or more of which is approved by CARB ZO to be capable of providing a minimum of 30% of vessel power required for main propulsion and auxiliary power operation, with zero tailpipe emissions when averaged over a calendar year. Slide 36 introduces the 2 main configurations of hybrid systems utilized in hovercraft designs and machines and other operating sectors as well, series and parallel configurations. Next slide, please. Slide 37 shows basic series and parallel configurations side by side in a land-based vehicle with a drivetrain as opposed to a propulsion system. Both series and parallel hybrid configurations utilize a combustion engine and onboard battery energy storage system. Series hybrid systems do not have a direct mechanical connection between the engine and the powertrain. Parallel hybrid configurations maintain the direct mechanical connection between the engine and powertrain and often utilize an E-machine or dual-purpose motor generator installed between the engine and powertrain. In hovercraft, the E-machine may act as a generator to charge batteries underway, or as an electric power take-in, either to augment diesel engine operation in boost mode, or to provide zero-emission operation with the engine shut down and clutched out by utilizing stored battery energy to power the propulsion system. Next slide. Slide 38 shows Bell Marine's trans-fluid powered parallel hybrid propulsion system in a commercial harbor craft. Color-coded power flow arrows show the operation in 3 basic operating modes. Let's see. Number 1, in electric mode, the engine is shut down and clutched out. Stored energy from the battery flows to the motor or to generate usable power, which is transmitted through the transmission to the propeller. Number 2, in booster mode, the engine is clutched in and operating at load, sending power through the transmission to the propeller. The engine power is augmented by stored energy from the battery flowing to the motor, which generates additional power to augment the engine power through the power take-in on the transmission. Power from both the engine and the motor are transmitted to the propeller. In engine mode, the 3rd operating mode, the engine is clutched in and operating at load, transmitting power through the transmission to the propeller. The transmission acts as a power takeoff, driving the motor as a generator, which sends power to charge the batteries. By utilizing engine power to both propel the vessel and charge the batteries simultaneously in engine mode, engine operation occurs at higher average loads where diesel engine operation is more fuel efficient. Hybrid operation in this manner reduces overall emissions and may lower operating costs over time, while operation in electric mode can provide zero emission operation capability in sensitive areas closer to shore. Next slide, please. Slide 39 provides some resources on where to find US EPA certified Tier 3 and Tier 4 marine engines. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has a publicly available marine engine certification database that is periodically updated with new engine families. CARB's CHC program has a table of commercially available Tier 4 marine and marinized off-road Tier 4 final engines available on CARB's Commercial Harborcraft Program website under the Resources tab. This marks the end of my presentation, so thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So we're going to have 15 minutes for Q&A again. I'm going to start with a question that we have in the Q&A for you. I think Bonnie's actually going to answer this one. The question's from Anthony. Has CARB evaluated the use of renewable diesel R99 on a life cycle basis to determine the GHG emissions improvement?
Yeah, thanks for that. That was from the last group. So we're pulling last group of questions. So pulling it forward for the first one here is the answer to that is yes. The R99, the GHG benefits of R99 are established under the low carbon fuel cycle regulation. And actually they also take credit for the emissions reductions on the GHG side, even under the Harborcraft rule. And so sometimes it's kind of difficult to see whether you go to the Harborcraft or the low carbon fuel standard location, but the carbon intensity of R99 has been established, and all of that technical background would be described in the low carbon fuel standard, probably initial statement of reasons. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Ramin, I see your hand up. What's your question?
Hello, thank you again. Can you guys hear me this time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Ramin Ross with WISPA. Again, we're engaged in this rule because of the facility side requirements. Andrew, really appreciate you walking through this. Given our interest in the facility side requirements, in particular those around shore power, can you give any insight? Well, our members are facing a number of challenges with implementing that. So is CARB planning to do a similar sort of walkthrough for shore power requirements and facility side requirements that are being implemented as part of this these amendments?
Not in this particular technical working group, so I think that is something that would be best to follow up with us offline on.
Okay, just via just setting up a meeting with your team. Is that probably the best way? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. So if you reach out to the Commercial Harborcraft inbox, we can coordinate a meeting with your group. That'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll go to one of our questions in the Q&A. Marine ports cannot comply with renewable diesel regulations due to the fuel's unavailability. Do you know if CARB has been working the fuel docks to source fuel?
The answer to that question is, oh, sorry, let me turn on my camera here. Sorry about that. The answer to that question is yes. So CARB's enforcement, the Commercial Harborcraft Program enforcement counterpart is the Marine Freight Enforcement Section. And yes, they have been working to map R99 fueling locations throughout the state. CARB also has published in 2023, there was a fact sheet on the R99 fuel requirement. And so the guidance on that is if an operator is in a particular operating location or region where they're unable to source the renewable 99 R99 fuel, then they would need to document their efforts to procure the fuel. However, there is no extension or exemption from the standing requirement. So if they make steps to reach out to the local fueling distributors or operators of bunker barges or land-based, truck fuel distributors, please maintain records of your efforts to acquire the fuel.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And we also have 2 DPF questions for you in the chat. I'll go first with Alex's question.
Okay.
How many models of level 3 DPFs for engines less than 600 kilowatts has CARB verified?
To date, there is only one level 2 marine DPF that is verified right now on CARB's verification website, and that is a Ripos A DPF model. There's currently a number of level 3 DPF verifications in progress right now, but due to the emissions testing and the in-use durability demonstration requirements of 1,000 hours of in-use operation, it can take some of the technology vendors and the vessel project partners, it can take them some time to complete this process. So currently there are no level 3 verified DPFs verified at this time.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And one more DPF question from Brian. What work has been done to determine if a CARB certified level 3 DPF impacts most diesel engine exhaust back pressure limits?
Okay, that's a good question. So the CARB verification procedure has a requirement, which is essentially a pre-installation compatibility assessment, which determines that the installation is not going to exceed the applicable engine OEM's maximum allowable specification for back pressure.
Okay, great. We'll move along to a question from Joe. How does CARB plan to manage repower projects for operators in the case a Tier 3 engine is approved, but a Tier 4 becomes available within 12 months of the compliance date? This seems it could cause difficulty for operators.
I'm not sure if the gentleman is asking if an engine becomes available that's Tier 4 12 months prior or 12 months after the compliance date. Can you please specify?
Yeah, Joe, if you want to raise your hand, I'll invite you to unmute and you can provide additional context there.
Okay, I'll give him a minute.
Let's see.
Otherwise, I can give maybe an incomplete answer, but I can give it a shot.
It looks like you put in the Q&A either, so either.
Either.
Okay. All right, so the cleanest engine requirement would apply 12 months prior to the applicable compliance deadline for your engine. So your engine compliance deadline would be found in the regulation on an in-use vessel under subsection E12 in tables 16 through 19, depending on your vessel type, depending on your engine tier level, and the engine category. So 12 months prior to the applicable deadline, you would be required basically to do a market survey to find out if there is a cleaner engine that could work in your application that has a suitable duty cycle rating if there is no Tier 4 engine available that would be suitable, then the requirement would be Tier 3. And then after you did your repower to Tier 3, if a Tier 4 engine became available after your compliance deadline when you had already repowered, you would not be required to repower again to a cleaner engine after you already repowered for compliance once under the amended commercial hovercraft regulation. So
right, and similarly, if you do your market analysis 12 months prior to the compliance deadline, and then a Tier 4 engine becomes available within that 12-month leading up to the compliance deadline, you don't have to switch to that Tier 4 at that time either.
Right, like staff understand that, you know, there could be considerable component or engine lead time from some of the manufacturers right now, which can actually exceed, you know, 12 to 16 months. So CARB staff are aware of this. So just to put that out there.
Great, thanks Tracy and Andrew. We have a question from Edmund. We at Passenger Vessel Association know of a member company that is seeking CARB verification of its DPF, but has not yet achieved it. Does CARB maintain a list of available verified DPFs for marine harborcraft? What is a harborcraft to do without verified DPFs?
Okay, that's a good question. So yes, the CARB verification website does have a list of currently verified DPFs. And like I mentioned earlier, there are no CARB verified level 3 DPFs. There is only one CARB verified level 2 DPF. Level 2 rating means that it would remove 50% or better of diesel PM. That's not likely to meet the applicable in-use performance standards that I discussed earlier. So to meet those very stringent PM in-use performance standards would likely require the level 3 DPF. Currently, there are none commercially available, so the pathway for the operators is to utilize the applicable compliance extensions that are available under subsection E12, and the one that comes to mind in that case is the extension E2, which is for component availability. And so since there's no currently there's no currently available or commercially available CARB verified level 3 DPF, then you would automatically meet the eligibility criteria to receive that extension, provided you're an otherwise CARB compliant operator.
Great, and I saw that Edmund Tracy provided a link for you in response to your question in the Q&A box as well.
Yeah, that's the link to the page. I'm sorry, Julia. That's the link to the page where the verified equipment is listed. So as Andrew mentioned, there's just one level 2 verified equipment currently listed, but at the point where level 3 verifications are completed, that will be listed on this page as well.
Yep, thank you.
Great. Thank you. All right, we've got one more question from Bill, and then we'll move on to our panel. Bill asks, how can we be listed as a project partner for DPF testing?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I would start by reaching out to, Freight Technology section, the Commercial Harborcraft Program inbox, and let us know that you're interested in pursuing a CARB DPF verification project, and then we can coordinate on our end to put you in touch with a number of the technology vendors that are producing these devices. We can set up a kickoff meeting with our freight approval section, which oversees the CARB verification procedure and the verification regulation as well. So we can set up a number of meetings to kick things off and see if we can start a good project.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I see a few more questions in the Q&A. Our wonderful CARB staff are going to look at those and see if they can answer some, but we are going to move on to our panel. So thank you all for your questions, and thanks, Andrew and Melissa for answering those in our Q&A sections. Next slide, please. All right, so at this point, we're going to transition to our panel discussion. This panel is comprised of community-based organizations and environmental organizations, and I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Teresa Bowie. She's the Climate Policy Director for Pacific Environment. And our panelists, Bill McGavern, Policy Director with Coalition for Clean Air, Janet School-Johnson, co-coordinator with Sunflower Alliance, Jane Stevenson, Climate Policy Associate with Pacific Environment, and Regina Sue, Senior Attorney, Earth Justice.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to CARB for hosting this very informative webinar. And my name is Teresa Bowie. I'm the Climate Policy Director for Pacific Environment. I'm pleased to be your moderator for this panel. I'm going to turn to our esteemed panelists and ask that you take a few minutes to introduce yourself, your organization, and also ask what motivated you to want to participate in this panel. So with that, Regina, can I ask you to start first?
Sure, thanks, Teresa. My name is Regina Sue, and I'm an attorney with Earth Justice. We're a nonprofit environmental law organization. I'm based in California and work on Earth Justice's Right to Zero program, which aims to shift our transportation system, buildings, and industries to zero emissions and run them all on a clean energy grid. Now, to achieve this, we rely heavily on partnerships with communities to advocate for zero emission solutions and regulations, including the adoption of a strong commercial hovercraft regulation in 2022 at CARB. The state of our air quality demands action now. 93% of Californians actually live in areas in violation of national ambient air quality standards. So in many, many parts of California, we don't meet the basic standards that ensure that our air is healthy enough to breathe. So I work closely with communities living near the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which is part of the South Coast Air Basin, consistently ranked as the most ozone polluted region in the nation. Just today, the South Coast was ranked as the smoggiest region in the nation for the 24th time in the American Lung Association's annual State of the Air report. Now, a major contributor to all this pollution in LA is freight movement. It's responsible for almost half of all nitrogen oxide pollution and about 18% of all particulate matter pollution in the region. All this pollution harms our health. It's associated with increased risks of heart and lung disease and cancer. And communities living near our ports and freight corridors in particular are disproportionately impacted by this pollution. Hovercraft operating at our ports also contributes to this pollution, and CARB amending the hovercraft regulation to include the first zero emission requirements for some segments was a huge victory for communities and an important step to reducing harmful port pollution in California. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and thank CARB for convening this technical working group and this panel discussion.
Thanks, Regina, for sharing those compelling stats. Janet, I would love to turn to you next to share some of the, introduce yourself, your organization, and also share what brought you to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, members of the CARB working group. This has been a really enlightening session. I am one of the coordinators of Sunflower Alliance, which is an East San Francisco Bay based organization committed to environmental and climate justice and the health and safety of all San Francisco Bay Area communities threatened by toxic pollution and climate disruption. I am based in Richmond, which has not just a port. We also have the largest refinery in Northern California, largest oil refinery, Chevron refinery. We have a coal terminal, 3 freeways, and off the charts asthma, heart disease, what Regina outlined in the way of health effects. This is what we have in Richmond. We're an environmental justice community, and so we are really concerned about removing some of these pollution sources to improve the health of especially our children. The elementary school that is closest to the port, visiting the principal's office, she opened a cabinet and showed all the inhalers that they have for their kids. These kids are suffering from asthma. They can't play outside. This is a travesty. We shouldn't have to put up with this. So I wanted to thank again the effort that's gone into this, especially zero emission engines. And I really couldn't add too much to what Regina outlined in terms of the critical nature of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet, for sharing your real life experiences. Bill, can I pass it to you next?
Sure. Thanks, Teresa. I'm Bill McGavran. I'm the policy director with the Coalition for Clean Air, which is a California nonprofit whose mission is to improve air quality, prevent climate change, and to protect public health. And given that mission, CCA started way back over 20 years ago, before I was involved.
Hey, Bill, sorry to interrupt. We're not hearing you. Are you able to go to the interpretation globe and select English as your channel?
Yeah, I can hear Bill on my end.
I can hear him
Yeah,
too.
so some of us can hear him and some of us can't. But I think if you go into the English channel, that'll fix it.
Where would I find that?
We're still not hearing you, Bill.
There should be a globe on the lower bar. You click on that globe and then you can select English.
If you don't see a globe, Bill, you might see the more with 3 dots. Mine was under there. I didn't have a globe.
Okay, I just selected English.
Wonderful. We can hear you now. Thanks, Bill.
Interesting. Okay, I'll start over. I'm Bill McGavran. I'm policy director with the Coalition for Clean Air, which is a California nonprofit whose mission is to improve air quality, protect public health, and prevent climate change. And for those reasons, CCA started focusing many years ago, before I was involved, on the pollution coming from our California ports, because of the burden that port pollution inflicts on the nearby communities and on the whole regions. And of course, part of that port pollution is coming from commercial harbor craft, and it's one of the many sources that we need to address to clean up the ports. So because of that, we participated in the recent amendments that CARB adopted, which we supported at the board, and we have supported the request to US EPA for an authorization from the federal government, which we are still waiting for. It's been long delayed. The reason why we supported the amendments is that they will generate significant health benefits through major reductions in harmful air and climate pollutants. They amend the existing policy to account for technological advancement, and they require more stringent emission control strategies and broaden the rule to capture emissions from additional vessel types. The benefits of the rule are significant. By shifting to zero emission and cleaner engine technologies and expanding the scope of the rule, the amendments will save hundreds of lives and billions of dollars in public health impacts. They'll cut carcinogenic diesel particle pollution from commercial harbor craft by about 90% and cut the NOx that forms smog and particles by more than half by the end of 2038. So we think these benefits are too good to pass up. They far outweigh the cost of the rule, and we'll continue to support it.
Thanks, Bill, for all your hard work on that. And last but not least, I'll ask Jean to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you today to talk about the community benefits of the Commercial Harborcraft Rule. My name is Jane, and I'm a Climate Policy Associate at Pacific Environment. We are an environmental nonprofit based in San Francisco and are working to get the shipping industry off fossil fuels as soon as possible. Pacific Environment has engaged with the Commercial Harborcraft Rule throughout the regulations development, and like Bill, we are supporting CARB getting EPA to authorize the regulation, which is still outstanding. We know how important this policy is for community health and greenhouse gas emission reductions, as my fellow panelists have discussed. The rule is also really important because it supports technological innovation in the zero-emission vessel market and provides an example for other jurisdictions to follow to reduce hovercraft pollution in their communities. We're seeing companies increasingly develop and deploy clean vessel technologies, including Crowley's first ever zero-emission tugboat in the US, which was delivered to the port of San Diego earlier this year and is expected to begin operating this spring. The country of Singapore has adopted a hovercraft regulation that was modeled off of California's policy and is even more ambitious. New York State is considering a bill to require zero-emission publicly funded ferries, and once EPA authorizes the commercial hovercraft rule, other US states can adopt and enforce the same policy. So what California does with its commercial hovercraft rule really has an impact across the whole country and the globe. It influences what other countries do. There's also record funding available in California and at the federal level to help ensure the maximum benefits of this rule are delivered to communities. And we at Pacific Environment are working to support these opportunities and broader compliance with the regulation because we know how important having the funding and the resources is to being able to comply with this rule. Earlier this year, for example, we hosted a webinar where we discussed available funding opportunities for vessel operators, and we've been working to protect the $60 million in funding that was allocated for hovercraft rule implementation in the state's budget. And we will continue to support resources for compliance as much as possible, because ultimately the community benefits of this rule are too great to be passed up, as Bill said, and they must be prioritized to reduce the longstanding disproportionate impacts of pollution on portside communities. I look forward to continuing to talk about this with the rest of the panelists and audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. So my first question to the panel is, how have port emissions, including from commercial hovercraft, impacted community health throughout the state? How do you believe the hovercraft regulation will directly benefit portside communities throughout the state in terms of improving air quality and public health? And maybe Janet, I'll ask you to start first.
As I mentioned before in my introduction, the Port of Richmond has a number of hovercraft. We see tugboats all the time moving in and out of the port. We also have a short run ferry that moves from Richmond to San Francisco, 14 round trips during the week and 5 or 6 round trips on weekend days. And if you folks have looked at some of those statistics, you can see how diesel particulate matter and nitrous oxides are they have their highest from ferries. And typically we have onshore winds that move from the bay to onshore to the city. And so all these sources of air pollution, of air contamination, wash into basically vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. The communities that are closest to the shore, other than the slightly more upscale areas of Point Richmond and Marina Bay, are low-income communities, working class, and these folks are most impacted by the contamination that comes from hovercraft. So this is why we are super concerned about this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Well, I'll just add one stat that I think we found very compelling during the debate over the rule at the board. And it's that the emissions from one commercial sport fishing vessel are equivalent to the particulate matter emissions from 162 school buses. So, sometimes we hear well, there aren't that many of these harbor craft and they're not a big part of the problem. But I think that kind of puts it into perspective.
Yeah, I'll also just add that when we're talking about port pollution, we really need to look at the whole picture and all of the impacts that are being placed on communities. When you're moving goods flowing through the ports, it starts with containers arriving by ships, being pulled into the harbor by tugboats, cargo handling equipment to move those containers off the ships, then trains and diesel trucks to move those to warehouses and then their final destination. So that's just a look at how much diesel equipment is used to facilitate goods movement and are operating at the ports. That's a lot of emissions associated with all this equipment. And hovercraft, like Bill said, even though there maybe aren't that many, it's a huge share of emissions. Without this regulation, hovercraft would be the top source of diesel pollution around the ports of LA and Long Beach. So, you know, in 2018, when CARB acknowledged the need to amend the previous hovercraft regulation, it was because of their assessment of near source cancer risk from hovercraft emissions for communities living near ports of LA and Long Beach. Just so for public health, this regulation was critical for protecting portside communities and also inland communities. As you heard during the staff presentation earlier, a striking fact about these hovercraft emissions is that it doesn't only affect portside communities. It affects air quality miles away, like 50 miles away from the ports, even increasing cancer risk for people living in Anaheim, right? So that's, you know, that's just a look at how much these hovercraft emissions can affect emissions and like air quality for everyone in California.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. So my next question is, what are some ways that your organization is communicating with and engaging with local residents to help raise awareness about the hovercraft regulation and its benefits and requirements? And Jane, can I start with you?
Sure. So the environment, as I mentioned, has been involved with the commercial hovercraft rule throughout the rulemaking process. So when the rule was being considered, we were leading a coalition of environmental justice and environmental groups to support the regulation and raise awareness about the importance for public health. And we've continued to raise awareness. And as we've been pushing for EPA to authorize the rule, we've engaged local community groups as much as possible and tried to get a broad coalition of support on our efforts, whether it's paid advertisements, it's letters that we're sending to EPA. We have tried very actively to engage the public and local community groups. We have regular coalition meetings where we discuss shipping pollution issues and talk about the commercial hovercraft rule regularly. We use email listservs to communicate with a wide variety of groups that are based throughout the state. You know, in a broader, to get broader community involvement, including stakeholders that are themselves regulated under the rule. We also held a webinar earlier this year with Port of Los Angeles focused on implementation of the rules. So we're working not just to inform communities about the benefits, but we're also working to support vessel operators by making sure they're aware of the rules requirements and available funding opportunities and other complementary programs such as LCFS that might be available to facilitate compliance, because ultimately if we can make compliance as feasible as possible for vessel operators, that's going to be what delivers the greatest benefits to communities. It will ensure that they're able to meet the targets on time, and then therefore the emissions reductions will occur as they should, and give communities the relief that they need.
Thanks, Jane. Anyone else? Go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in here. That Sunflower Alliance is part of the coalition that Pacific Environment has formed. And we also have we also publicize through our email listserv, and we have a weekly announcements that on climate issues, and we forefront this issue on that. It's available on our website.
Great, thank you. Anyone else wants to chime in?
I don't have too much to add. Similarly to Pacific Environment, Earth Justice works with coalitions, so we do rely heavily on our community partners who have a member base and to disseminate information and give updates. We've informed our partners and community about the importance of the EPA authorization and push them to voice their support for that so that EPA can move quickly to authorize that regulation. So it can move forward with, and other states can adopt as well. I think engaging with communities and local residents who are impacted is critical. That's what has driven Earth Justice's advocacy in this space. I think what I've found helpful in engaging with community members is all of the fact sheets and the resources that CARB puts out that makes a very technical regulation easily digestible. So I thank CARB for putting that out and hope that you continue to do so with implementation so that we can continue to keep community up to date on the progress that is being achieved through this regulation.
And one piece that I'll add looking forward is that in order to successfully deploy zero emission boats, we're going to need to have charging infrastructure. And the nearby communities need to be part of the planning process for that charging infrastructure. And this isn't official yet, so I can't be really specific, but Coalition for Clean Air is part of a number of organizations that are working with an electric boat company on charging infrastructure at 2 of the major ports in Southern California, and we'll be helping with the community outreach portion of that.
Great. Well, Regina, Bill, you touched on my next question a little bit, but it's, what are the recommendations you have for CARB? And also, like, how can community or environmental organizations work with community groups to better address the local concerns regarding hovercraft emissions?
I can start. So I think education on both sides is helpful, right? I pointed to how helpful CARB's technical expertise, emissions modeling, health analyses are. Those are invaluable to understanding the impact of these regulations and all the benefits that come from these important regulatory developments that will spur technology and move us towards zero emissions. Often with these regulations, there is a compromise. This rule does include a lot of flexibilities, taking into account concerns from industry, for example. Through the regulatory process, environmental and community organizations, including Earth Justice and our partners, did push for example, zero emissions for all hovercraft segments. So I think that's something to keep in mind. We do need to push harder and we do need more emission reductions. That's just the nature, the reality of where we are in terms of our air quality. So I think one thing I hope CARB keeps in mind is you need to continue to be responsive to community concerns, keep community informed about the implementation of the rule, where we are in terms of emission reductions that are achieved as things phase in, but also be transparent about what needs to be done next. I think that's a critical piece that we can't lose track of.
I agree with Regina's points. And also I would say that what we've seen work is when state agencies partner with community-based organizations that have proven track records of delivering for their communities. And it's often those CBOs that really know how to engage community members much more than a huge state agency could. So we strongly recommend that, and that includes working with the community steering committees that have been set up under the Community Air Protection Program, also known as AB 617, We've got steering committees that are near the ports of LA Long Beach, of San Diego, of Oakland, and I really think they should be part of the process.
Thanks, Bill. Janet, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Bill said about AB 617 communities. Richmond was one of the first to be part of that, and we're in the process of approving our community emissions reduction plan. And to get, I think there needs to be really close communication between CARB and the individual air districts on this. Particularly in the area in the south where the air district has done a lot of groundbreaking work in terms of emission controls. So thank you for bringing that up, Bill.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And just wanted to follow this track a little bit more. So, thank you to CARB and their enforcement staff for putting this Harborcraft rule together, but also successfully implementing. What other steps can CARB take to make sure that there is transparent and authentic communication on the implementation side and then enforcement side of regulations such as Harborcraft? And so, Regina, I hear that you mentioned you're making sure that the fact sheets are more digestible, a little bit less technical, and Bill, the AB 617 steering committee member outreach. But if there's anything else that you would like to add, to anyone on the panel.
I'll just say I think continuing to have forums such as these are important. I know this is something that is required under the regulation and will occur at a certain frequency that's outlined in the resolution CARB adopted. But it's important to have these public forums where community members, as well as other stakeholders, are able to ask their questions and get that response from CARB. And I know CARB staff have been very generous with their time and being willing to meet with stakeholders who have questions, or just continuing to do that and have these public forums going forward.
Thanks, Jane.
Sorry, I muted myself before I was going to finish. It's I was trying to say it was a technical regulation, and the fact sheets that Regina mentioned are really important, but sometimes you need to have these meetings where people can ask their questions directly.
Great. And then just flipping that, what is the role of community or environmental advocates to, what is their role in terms of helping, and working with CARB to address pollution challenges associated with these Harborcraft emissions?
Well, our role is to push for more protection for public health, always.
I'll add, communities are by no means responsible for the enforcement and for the development of the regulation. That's CARB's job, but I think that communities are an important source of information and should be treated as partners in the space. There, with other regulations, with the at-birth rule, for example, there are many instances in which communities are aware and report when ships are not plugging in, and so by default, communities are helping to monitor. Not that that is a responsibility, but that is the reality of living on the ground in the communities where this pollution occurs, is that the near-port residents know what's going on, what's working, what doesn't. And so I think communities provide an important they're an important source of information for CARB about the reality of regulation implementation on the ground, what is working and what's not, and where we need to do more.
Yeah, I'll just add it's important not to underestimate the value of input from communities on solutions, as Jane said. I think engagement with community is important to understand the lived experiences and, for example, what sources community members are most concerned about, right? Like they're the ones who are living with all this pollution. They're the ones seeing things on the ground, what's impacting them. And the communities I work with, for example, they've been advocating for zero emissions for years now because they see a dire need to move towards zero emissions because of all the impacts, the health issues that they see their communities going through. And so there are coalition partners, community organizations that I work with who put together technology assessment reports. You know, they keep track of all the different zero emission technologies. They have context on the sources, like what they're doing, any issues, like for example, during the pandemic, all the ships at anchor, right? And seeing all of that and how it impacts their daily lives. So I think it's important to hear those accounts and really learn from the knowledge that community members have as CARB, you know, works on implementing this regulation and assesses any changes, right? I think that's just one takeaway from working with the communities that I work with.
Thanks, Regina. Janet, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I just want to echo what Regina and Jane said, that community knowledge should not be underestimated, that lived experience just cuts through a lot of the verbal red tape. And more than anything, people in the community are they are owed more than just input and feedback, that they need to be at the table whenever possible when decisions are made about affecting their health. Boom.
Here, here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. And then what, like how can environmental organizations help in terms of incentivizing or promoting newer and cleaner technologies for commercial hovercraft? And maybe Jane, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think this is something, as I mentioned, that Pacific Environment has been focused on, as an environmental group who is going to continue to push CARB for the regulations that are needed to protect public health. What role can we play in trying to support the compliance with these rules? So of course, as an environmental org, we can't do everything, but we've been trying as much as possible to disseminate information about available opportunities in California and beyond, because there's unprecedented funding at the federal level, most notably the $3 billion in Clean Ports Program funding, which is currently open for applications until the end of May. So we're in this time when there's a lot of increasing funding opportunities, and it's hard to keep track of them all. So we try to disseminate that information. We're working with the grant writing firms to try and support vessel operators who want to apply for funding. We advocate for additional funding at the federal and state level and try to protect funding that already exists. So that's a priority of ours and it will remain a priority in the coming years as this rule is implemented. Yeah, I'll stop there and let other panelists jump in.
Well, for Coalition for Clean Air, just recently on April 12th, we organized and hosted a solutions tour of the ports of LA and Long Beach. So that's one thing we're trying to do, is draw attention to solutions when they're being offered, in the private or public sector. And also, I mentioned that we're partnering with some in the industry on infrastructure solutions. And I also agree with Jane on the importance of incentive funding. I'm glad she talked about the money that is available at the federal level, because it's not a good year at the state level. I was at the Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Climate this morning, trying to defend the climate budget, but obviously a tough year for the budget in California.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And Regina, you helped lead a coalition in support of the funding at ports. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure, we did see unprecedented funding for electrifying ports, but because of some difficulties with the state budget. You know, we've seen some of that funding be pushed back, and we're continuing to request that that funding be restored and accelerated, as Jane mentioned. And so you know, we do track the various incentive and funding programs, and as Jane said, there is an unprecedented level of funding that can go towards electrifying hovercraft and port operations generally. And so I think there is an important role for both communities and environmental organizations to play in providing input to go into shaping these programs to make sure that they can be taken advantage of. I think one challenge is making sure that any projects are eligible for these funding opportunities. And so I think there is some work in both protecting this funding, making sure that any funding that's there stays there, getting additional funding, because we also acknowledge that, you know, this transition can be difficult. As Bill alluded to, you know, there are a lot of infrastructure issues that we need to start working on now. So, you know, those are some of the things that we focus on, because we do need to be proactive in making sure that all of those pieces are in place so that this rule can be implemented quickly and smoothly, and that, you know, for example, other segments that aren't required to go towards zero emissions under this rule maybe are incentivized to do that starting sooner, right? So yeah, I hope that adds a little to, Jane and Bill covered a lot, so.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone on this panel. Just to wrap up, my last question to you as our closing is just, you know, what impacts are you hoping to see in communities throughout the state from this hovercraft regulation? Maybe Janet, if you want to start first.
Well, improved health of our kids, improved, you know, fewer visits to the emergency room for kids who have asthma attacks. I think that would be number one. And then on the other end, better life outcomes, better life expectancy for our elders in our communities. I think if we achieve that, we have achieved a ton.
I'll jump in and say, you know, not just reducing adverse health outcomes in general, but reducing health disparities between communities of color and low-income communities who are predominantly affected by vessel pollution and wealthier and less diverse communities. I think it's important to recognize that this is a big environmental justice issue, and that addressing emissions from hovercraft is critical for the state to achieve not only its air quality goals, but its environmental justice goals. So reducing the disparity in health outcomes between communities is extremely crucial.
Yeah, I think it's no surprise that our support for the hovercraft regulation was driven by the staggering health benefits. Without this rule, hovercraft would already be the largest contributor of near source cancer risk at the San Pedro Bay ports. So, you know, if you look at the estimates for the health benefits, it's pretty remarkable, right? Reducing diesel pollution by 90% in the South Coast, and thereby reducing cancer risk for more than 9.7 million people in the region. So really, like, that's relief that our communities desperately need. And the benefits of this rule, even though, you know, I'm very focused on the South Coast, we'll see these in regions that are in non-attainment, like San Francisco Bay Area, San Joaquin Valley, Ventura County, San Diego County. It really helps communities across the state. It's an 89% reduction in diesel particulate matter emissions statewide, right? So it's preventing 531 premature deaths statewide. Like, you'll save 531 lives just from the emission reductions from this rule. So the better health outcomes that we'll see as a result are really the most important impacts that we're hoping to see. And as Jane mentioned, you know, we do see disproportionate health burdens in portside communities. And that is one thing that I think we really want to see, shifting our ports and the freight industry to zero emissions is important. And this transition to cleaner harbor craft is definitely one thing that has to be realized.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would say, a ferry ride or a visit to the harbor should not mean getting a lung full of diesel exhaust. And even more importantly, living near a port or a harbor should not mean having to always live with that diesel exhaust.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating in your time today. With that, Julia, I will pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you to our panel members for a really important discussion. Appreciate you all being here. At this point, we're going to open up for Q&A for our panel folks. So if you have a question that you would like to ask them, please raise your hand. And then also just want to note that we do have some questions in the Q&A, and ask that folks, stay focused on the agenda and call back to our meeting principles of being respectful in conversation with each other. So with that said, I will open it up to questions for our panelists. Please feel free to raise your hand, or if you have a question for a particular panelist, you can put it in the Q&A box. Oh, and I'm sorry, actually, Bonnie wanted to say something as well. So Bonnie, I know that you wanted to say a few words about our panelists as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of wrap it up. I know we have, it looks like extra time for questions. So I just wanted to thank everybody that was on the panel. I know that you guys are all super busy, and so we really appreciate you providing a perspective about how the community groups and the environmental groups can have a seat at the table. And we certainly are so happy that you agreed to be had a seat at our table. And so I just wanted to thank you guys for that. So with that, I'll turn it back to questions. And it looks like we are time-wise doing pretty well. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. All right, any questions for our panelists? I see Graham, you've got a hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Graham from Green Yachts. There's two things I'd like to say. One,
and I'm not hearing Graham. Graham, I think you're having the same interpretation function issues. So if you look at the bottom of your screen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yep,
Okay, great.
Gotcha now.
It works better when you can hear the words and not just see the mouth moving. Two things. Graham from Green Yachts. We focus on marine electrification. I want to say two things. One, I had to step out to address the purpose of this entire meeting. The question is really whether clean diesel engines and zero emission equipment is available for installation. And the answer for zero emission equipment is electric propulsion equipment specifically is unequivocally yes. We've been sitting waiting to install zero emission equipment for about 2 years now on some of our clients' vessels. We've been sitting on US Coast Guard applications that are ready to go for 23 months. And the thing that is holding it back is CARB policies related to funding that don't allow the Coast Guard application to even be filed, or it will not be reimbursable. So there's some CARB funding policies that are getting in the way. And I wanted to say that when the CHC staff were talking, but I apologize, I couldn't. And what really we'd like is for the CARB funding policies to be aligned with the regulatory policies, because they are not currently. For the topic that you guys were speaking about, I think it's so important. And I know this is a story that Teresa knows, and it's an unfortunate one, but the only Latina applicant for demonstration funding from CARB, who was on the call earlier, received a higher score than her competition, which is a large company, received a higher score according to staff. That other company got funding, and her small micro enterprise run by a minority woman with a higher score by staff got denied funding. I think I would like to ask the environmental groups not just to advocate for emission reductions in low-income communities, which is really important, but that community members in the community be the beneficiary of these grants, and so that it's not somebody else coming into the community to reduce emissions. It is leaders within the community who are being recognized as being part of the community and funded to lead their own community emission reduction efforts. I think this is really important, and CARB has to, wants to reduce emissions in low-income communities, and they have, scoring based on it, but there is no scoring based on, the project being led by somebody from the community. And I think that is an important part of emissions reductions. And I just wanted to highlight, as you work to advance our efforts to address pollution, particularly as an environmental justice issue in lower income and disadvantaged communities, that grants to folks who are members of that community be part of what defines working with the disadvantaged communities. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Graham, for your question. It sounds like it's a little bit more of a question for CARB than for our panelists. So panelists, feel free to go off camera if you want, and if there's a question directed to you guys, to come back on camera. And I think our CARB staff are gonna handle your question, Graham.
I think I'd be interested
Oh,
in some
sorry,
follow-
Bonnie. I'm hearing an echo on your audio. I don't know if anyone else is hearing that too. You've got kind of a double audio going on there.
Okay, how's that doing? Is that better?
A little bit. Is anybody else hearing that?
I still hear the echo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can hear that.
Okay, let me try again. Is that any better?
No.
It's still going.
Okay, well, I'll try to figure it out, and maybe somebody else can take the question, maybe Tracy.
It might be a problem with your headphones or with your earbuds.
I don't know if I'm unmuted still, but while Bonnie's fixing her technical, I also just want to say that the regulatory staff, and it's not because they're on this call, I just want to say that the regulatory staff, Tracy, Andrew, and everybody, has been phenomenal and flexible, and have been really working hard to get the regulations implemented in a way that is feasible. And I want to commend them. I think I'm trying to contrast the difference between their efforts and the other side of CARB, which is the funding side.
Okay, I think I can start while we see if Bonnie can address her audio issues. I thank you for your comments, Graham. As far as funding and the specific issue of I think you're referring to the demo pilot applications. We as the regulatory staff can't really comment on that. So that's more of a discussion on the incentive side. But we hear you as far as, trying to, align regulatory requirements with requirements to obtain funding, and, how that can be a challenging process. And, on our end, we try to work with the funding programs, and they try to work with us, make things work as smoothly as possible. I think it's, it's always a work in progress, but that is on our radar.
Great, thanks Tracy for
Yeah,
stepping
let
in.
me add a little bit to that on the U.S. Coast Guard side. So, Graham, could you elaborate on what you were saying about the various incentives funding programs
Sure.
requiring the U.S. Coast Guard design change approval process to go through before they fund? Is that what you're referring to?
It is. So first of all, the Coast Guard design approval process is not covered by most of the funding programs, such as MOIR or CORE. It is covered by demonstration funding. And if you look at the demonstration program guidelines, you are not allowed to do any work before the grant agreement is signed, or it is not eligible for funding. So for one of our clients, we've been sitting on the Coast Guard design approval, our design application, and not submitting it for 23 months. Because if we submit it before the grant agreement is signed, it is not eligible for reimbursement, and small businesses can't afford to just eat a $200,000 cost because submitting it in a timely manner would then prevent it from being covered by grant funding because it was submitted and an action taken before a grant agreement contract was signed.
Okay. Yeah, again, like what Tracy's response was, this sounds like a more program specific inquiry. So I think we should probably follow up offline with the Low Carbon Transportation Investments Program that is implementing the Advanced Technology Demonstration and Pilots Program.
Yep.
This is not really a commercial hovercraft program specific line of inquiry.
Completely agree. And I just wanted to highlight for the CARB staff on the regulatory side that the challenge in the implementation of your regs is not the availability of equipment, at least for zero emission. It's the misalignment from the funding side that has slowed things down. And that's helpful for you guys to know where the challenge lies.
Great, thanks Graham, and thanks Andrew and Tracy for stepping in. We have some time left, so we're going to go back and address some of the remaining questions in the Q&A. There's a question from Joe. Many operators will want to complete the Tier 3 and Tier 4 survey prior to the 12 months of the compliance date. Can I confirm that if an operator gets approval for Tier 3, they will not be compelled to repower to Tier 4? I think you may have somewhat addressed that already, Tracy, but
yeah, so this is referring back to the requirement, 12 months in advance of a compliance date, to evaluate whether a Tier 4 engine that is appropriate for your operation is available. So there's no process that requires CARB to approve whether a Tier 3 is available at that time. There's no approval process for us to approve your market analysis. That's for you to document. And so hopefully that answers your question. There's and as I said, if a Tier 4 then becomes available, within 12 months leading up to the compliance date or after it, you don't have to then repower to a Tier 4.
Great, thanks, Tracy. All right. We have a question from Cheryl. Who assures that the right size DPF is used on a commercial harbor craft, since the verification process is only for one vessel type?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the CARB verification process verifies that the DPFs are compatible with a number of different engine families. So it's not necessarily per vessel or per vessel type. So it really depends on the engine particulate matter certification standards, or the cert levels. Basically what's coming out of the engine, and also the maximum rated power and the exhaust mass flow that can come out of the engine at rated power. Those all factor into the size of the DPF in order to keep the exhaust back pressure under control below the engine OEM's maximum specification. And so the pre-installation compatibility assessment and the CARB verification procedure would cover that. This would ensure that the DPF that is going to be installed in a particular vessel on a particular engine is compatible with that engine, and that it's not going to exceed the maximum spec for back pressure, and that it's also compatible with the levels of PM that are coming out of that engine.
Great, thanks, Andrew. We've got another question in the chat from Alex. For vessels that are required to meet 30% ZEET, would the engine in the hybrid system be required to meet EPA Tier 4 plus CARB Level 3 DPF?
Yes, the engine would have the same requirement as any other engine in the Hovercraft regulation.
Great, thanks, Tracy. All right, we've got a question from Emil. There are issues with EPA Tier 4 certification of marine engine families less than 600 kilowatts. However, EPA Tier 3, and in my opinion, 3 certified engines with SCR after treatment are available. Is there any method these engines can have some certainty they will be approved in the future? Then it would be possible to start the process to also develop and approve DPFs for these.
So let me ask a clarifying question there. I thought I heard something about IMO 3 being accepted.
It's
okay.
IMO 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
The answer to that is no, because the engines that are certified to IMO standards, which are International Maritime Organization, their certification standards do not account for diesel particulate matter. They're only certified to NOx emission standards. So compliance with the Commercial Hovercraft Regulation typically requires a Clean Air Act compliant US EPA certified engine. And that engine can be Clean Air Act compliant and IMO compliant if it is dual certified, but it requires either US EPA certified Clean Air Act compliant or dual certified, including the US EPA Clean Air Act compliant certification, along with the IMO certification.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. All right, another question from Cheryl. What funding is available for commercial hovercraft operators? Requirements are costly and compliance for some require a new vessel, as shown in CARB's study with CMA.
So I think we covered funding a little bit, but just to reiterate, there are several funding programs available for CHC operators. One that's been mentioned on this webinar is the low carbon transportation incentives demonstration and pilot program. That program just completed a funding cycle that did fund that they are entering into funding agreements with several CHC operators. There's Carl Moyer, there's Volkswagen, there's Core, which is for zero emission. And we do have a fact sheet on our fact sheets page with a list of funding opportunities that we try to keep that relatively current. So
okay, great. We have a suggestion from Seong Kim that for the next working group that we invite input from ports, vessel operators, and manufacturers to gather their opinions.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, this is the first of 3 working group meetings that we're having this year. As Bonnie mentioned in her introduction, the next working group meeting is going to be focused a lot on technology specifically. UC Irvine is doing a technical evaluation that's pretty thorough. We're also going to have zero emission panels, and then we have additional items planned for the 3rd working group meeting, including a Coast Guard presentation, as well as panels on implementation of the regulation, tier 4 repowers. So we have a lot of that content planned for future meetings. This was just the first of 3.
Great. Thanks for reminding us of that, Tracy. We have a comment from Alex. who appreciates the effort to increase funding. Private operators, especially those that have kept their equipment modern, have very few, if any, sources available. Grants targeting public entities and those with older equipment seem to get all the funding. So thanks for that comment, Alex. And we've got a question from Michael. The eWolf is currently being charged by a temporary low capacity system, which limits its value to basic demonstrations and tours on a daily use basis or taking multiple days to charge. This is not practical for an electric ferry, both operationally and financially. What does CARB suggest is the approach for charging ZETA vessels during the period between when the vessels are delivered and the permitting and installation process for shore power is complete? In many cases, this is anticipated to be 3 or more years between vessel delivery and charging system commissioning.
Yeah, we've been made aware of the situation with the eWolf, and I don't think we can really speculate further on, what the suggested approach would be for ZEET vessels in general. This would be a case-by-case discussion.
Correct.
Okay.
I think I can add a little detail to that particular project. I don't believe it's 3 years out until the infrastructure is ready to be energized. I think it's a short-term issue with that particular project, waiting for permits, I believe. In the interim period, that vessel is actually a zero emission capable hybrid, and it does have onboard diesel electric power generation capability. And so the vessel has engines on board that are currently fully compliant with the commercial hovercraft regulation. And so the vessel can also opt to utilize those engines during the interim period.
Great, thanks, Andrew. All right, and we have one question left in the Q&A, and I thought I saw a hand up from one of our attendees. So if you did have your hand up, there we go. Kurt, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm with Crowley, so I just want to provide a bit of context on the eWolf. As you're explaining, the shoreside charging infrastructure, we expect to be commissioned here in the next couple months at most. So once that's commissioned and active, that'll allow us to charge the eWolf at 1 megawatt. So just for a little bit of context, we should be able to fully recharge the vessel in a matter of about 5 hours once that's operational.
Oh, thank you for that background. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. All right, and we've got one more question left in the Q&A. Oh, I have another one. Ron asks and lets us know that they support the construction of hybrid and zero emission boats. Unfortunately, the commercial hovercraft regulations are dramatically outpacing the products needed to meet them. For example, there are no engines currently available for purchase for either hybrid or non-hybrid boats that require less than 600 kilowatts for propulsion to meet the current requirements. This leads us to the conclusion that every new build project will need to be approved on an individual case-by-case basis submitted by the vessel owner to CARB for approval. Is that correct?
So
I heard a lot right there, so I think the first half was incorrect and the second half is correct in that under subsection E10 in the regulation, the operator is required to submit a Z application. However, the first part of that question or statement was incorrect. So Tracy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm reading the question here. So referring to engines that are less than 600 kilowatts, though, so the regulation says that if there is no tier 4 engine available, that a tier 3 engine can be used. So engines under 600 kilowatts should be available, referring to non-hybrid boats in your question.
Yeah, there will always be something available at the time. If there is that cleaner engine, the tier 4 engine available, then the vessel build would be subject to the in-use performance standards on the engine side. If an engine is not available for a new build at the time of the keel lane, then the requirement would most likely be to meet the Tier 4 in-use performance standards. And there's plenty of, Tier 3, and there's plenty of Tier 3 engines that are out there that are commercially available under 600 kilowatts. Another option too that some people might not know about is there's a number of marinized off-road Tier 4 final engines that CARB has listed on our website under resources. There's actually a table that lists the currently commercially available Tier 4 certified marine engines and the marinized Tier 4 final engines. And so you can find more information on those engines on our website there.
Right, and then I'll just
Great,
address,
thanks.
I'm sorry, I'll just address the last sentence here that every new build project will need to be approved on an individual case-by-case basis submitted by the vessel owner to CARB for approval. So that's correct for ZEET vessels. So again, ZEET vessels are vessels that meet the definitions in the regulation of zero emission or zero emission capable hybrid. They are required to go through that ZEET process in subsection E10. For other new build projects, that are Tier 4 projects, currently, we don't have any level 3 DPFs approved. So there would need to be an approval for a new build vessel also, but that's pretty straightforward since there are no DPFs available.
Okay, and it looks like Ron has his hand up and also added some clarification in the chat, but not T3 with DPF. So I think he's specifically asking about Tier 3 with DPF.
Okay, so the requirement, if there is no Tier 4 engine available, would be to build the vessel with Tier 3 engines, but you would, as Tracy said, you would still be required at that point to meet the Tier 3 in-use performance standards. So that would likely require use of a CARB verified level 3 DPF retrofit when one does become commercially available. And when it does become commercially available, the operator would be required to install it in the vessel within 6 months of it becoming commercially available for order.
Great.
Yeah, I
Thank you
mean,
both.
we highly encourage anyone who is doing a new build project and has questions about this to contact us directly. We are more than happy to have one-on-one conversations to make the requirements clear.
Great, thank you both. We have a question from Tyler. Has funding for workforce training been considered to provide service and support for these novel emission reduction technologies being introduced into the marine market? This is especially true for hybrid and zero emission technologies using high DC voltage charging systems and advanced battery systems.
So I'll refer back to the demo pilot program under the low carbon transportation incentives. Workforce training is a criteria that's considered when those projects are scored. So the answer is yes for that particular program.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Amber. Would available dock space be considered when determining vessel tier? Tier 4 larger than Tier 3, dock space is already difficult to obtain, and building more will trigger environmental view. But I think she said that was changed to availability review. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say no at this point. Available dock space for vessel size is not considered under the current commercial hovercraft regulation.
Okay, great. And our last question from eGuest. What's the definition of available? Typically, availability for engine operations entails understanding costs of all costs. If a company can't afford it and to operate, that may imply it's not available.
That sounds more like a feasibility question versus commercially available. So for commercially available, if your component is not commercially available, such as a CARB verified level 3 DPF right now, there's the E2 extension. If you're looking at a feasibility issue as to whether or not you can repower to Tier 4 and then fit the CARB verified DPF design in your vessel, then that would be most likely an E3 extension process, which would require a third-party naval architect study. There's also a number of other extensions that could be applicable. For example, the E5 extension is a scheduling extension that can provide operators with a renewable one-year extension for a number of different eligibility criteria, including component availability and component lead times from the manufacturers or supply chain delays.
Right, okay, I can answer Dennis's question. Julia, do you want to read it?
Yes. Dennis's question is, when an in-use vessel changes ownership within the state and is over 600 kilowatts, does the vessel have to meet Tier 4 requirements, or can the existing Tier 3 engines remain?
Yeah, the change of ownership within the state is irrelevant in terms of compliance with the regulation. So if an engine has already been repowered to Tier 3 to meet the requirements of the regulation, it can keep its Tier 3 engines.
Yeah, it would be considered an in-use vessel if it
Right.
previously operated in California.
Right, it would
So-
not meet that definition of newly acquired, which I think is what you're asking.
Right, even though it's a new purchase, it's not or newly acquired, it's not a new build, it would be considered in use. That's what it sounds like from the.
If it was already operating in the state. Right?
Yeah. That's what I think the scenario is in the question.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Andrew and Tracy, for getting through those questions and for everyone for submitting them. Happy that we were able to make time to take more questions and provide more answers. Lizzie, just want to check and see if you can throw up our last slide there. We just have a few housekeeping items and next steps to share with you all before we adjourn. So workshop 2, as mentioned, will be covering a technology assessment, and it is scheduled for Wednesday, May 29th from 12 to 4:30. There's some information there, contact information for if you have any additional comments, to send those to harborcraft@arb.ca.gov. And if you have any questions specifically regarding the technical working group, you can reach out to Adriana at adriana.chavez@arb.ca.gov. And then there's also a link there for the mailing list. I'll drop that link in the chat for everybody in case you do want to subscribe to the mailing list. And then also just want to check in with our CARB folks and see if there's anything else that you guys want to address before we officially adjourn for the day.
Just a general thank you to everybody who stuck with us here until 3:47. We really appreciate your participation and your perspectives, and so thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists and presenters. We'll see you all at workshop number 2. And in the meantime, please reach out to those contacts if you have any additional questions or concerns.